Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's time for another top 10 list. Well, here we are. It's finally time for me to cap off this series on M83 so that we'll be able to move on to the next one. And this will be the last video in this discography review. Yes, that does mean I will actually not be doing a worst to best ranking for this band. I had initially planned on it, but after deliberating on it for a while, I felt like it wouldn't quite work, as I have no idea what my second favorite album from them is. I know my favorite album from theirs is Hurry Up We're Dreaming, I know my least favorite of theirs is Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts, and I know my second least favorite is Digital Shades Volume 1. But as for any of the placements in between, it's functionally a five-way tie. I enjoy the remaining albums pretty much the same amount and have such wildly different rationales for enjoying each one that they become near impossible to effectively compare against each other. Do I go with Before the Dawn Heals Us, which has tons of their highest high points and hardest hitting emotional moments, but also their single lowest points and Can't Stop, as well as being a bit clunky and scattershot as a whole? Do I go with Saturdays Equals Youth, which is the exact opposite in having only a small handful of my favorite tracks, but is much more consistent and cohesive than any of their other albums? Do I go with the self-titled, which is more up my usual alley than much of their other work and has been surprisingly one of the most replayable for me, despite some much more subpar production? Or the glorious retro cheese fest of junk, which holds up way better than much of its initial critical reception would imply it would and still stands as one of my favorite albums of 2016? Or DSV2 for being an all-instrumental album practically designed to be right up my alley, if also a bit unwieldy in spots? All of these albums both felt like they could fit the number 2 spot in a ranking, and yet didn't feel quite right in the spot either. And when I realized I couldn't decide between any of these 5, I finally decided against ranking their albums altogether. As instantly recognizable a style as Anthony Gonzalez and company have stuck to since the beginning, they've always been surprisingly difficult to fully pin down or pigeonhole. Every album feels different from the next, and that's why I thought they could be such a prime candidate for me to have done this discography review on them, and discuss all their widely varied evolutions, from underground lo-fi electronic work inspired by noise rock and shoegaze, to big stadium rock and emo, to straight ambient, to their semi-mainstream breakout with 80s synth pop and new wave revivalism, and more. And it feels like every single phase of the M83 catalog has a separate fan base holding it up as their best. But as consistent and widely varied as their albums are, I think M83 might actually be more of a band that are best taken from an individual track perspective. Pretty much every single track they've made has the ability to stand on its own outside of the greater album context, and delivers its own unique burst of emotionality that no other M83 track does. So, we're going to go through those. Reminder that, as per usual, this is just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. It only reflects which tracks left the most of an impression on me personally. If you don't agree with my picks, you can feel free to post your own in the comments. And while I doubt I'm going to be putting any takes on here that are going to be like super controversial, I seriously doubt anyone's list is going to perfectly mirror my own. You could theoretically build your list entirely out of tracks I've left out of this video. Also, don't necessarily hold me to these picks and these placements. My opinion is always liable to change in the near or far future depending on my mood, or if they really end up releasing more music down the line. You just never know. And this was kind of a close race between some of these rankings, so yeah, I don't know. But I think that'll be enough preload. So let's finally get into the top 10 best M83 songs. Number 10, Teen Angst from Before the Dawn Heals Us. I kind of struggled on what to put in this spot. There were a number of different tracks that would have felt like they fit here, and this wasn't a track that I have an especially deep history with. For whatever reason, it never stuck out to me when I first went through the M83 catalog many years ago, but after I've done this series, this track has just kind of stuck with me and felt like one of their most representative tracks that best illustrates what this band is all about. A big emotional climax with tons of propulsive walls of guitars and melodic synths made to sound huge and spacious, especially aided by some choirs in the background. And of course Gonzalez's half-whispered musing about how teenagers so often live fast and burn out quickly, trying to recapture the feeling of being around that age. Recapturing your youth is a running theme of the entire M83 catalog, but this is one of their tracks that most directly centers itself around this theme, and most effectively conveys it as well, with one of their catchiest and most memorable tunes to boot. Fantastic track, to be sure. Number 9. Asterisk from Before the Dawn Heals Us. Nearly half the track listing of Before the Dawn Heals Us was in the initial running for this list. There's so many fantastic individual tracks from that particular album that are big winners for me for entirely different reasons. But this was one of the tracks that I specifically remembered being a winner when I first went through their catalog, and it's one of the loudest and most intense tracks on the album as well. What I really like about this one isn't just the sheer propulsion and the soaring lead guitar melodies, it's the way it abruptly stops and starts. Hard cutting between walls of noise and crashing drums, and really quiet but really tense minimal synth bass. This does a really great job of setting up that tension and release in a way that no other M83 track does. There was definitely a part of me who wanted to give more love to this album's ambient moments, like In the Cold I'm Standing or Let Men Burn Stars, which are also stellar, but didn't quite make the cut. But these louder and more hard-hitting moments from this album ended up seeing more representation, I guess since there's something special about this album that other albums of theirs don't do as well. And Asterisk is definitely one of the most unique and well-executed louder tracks they've ever come up with. Now, of course, if you were looking for something on the more ambient side, you got this next pick. Number 8. Splendor from Hurry Up We're Dreaming. As good as M83 are at putting together big, loud, emotional ragers, it's the quieter moments in their catalog that really made me as much of a fan of them as I am. They are just as good at putting together really effective ambient cuts or simple and straightforward ballads like this one. There's not all that much to Splendor, it's just a very simple stripped-back piano cut with a whispery guest vocal appearance from Brad Lehner from the band Medicine that occasionally pays off into stretches of warm acoustic guitars, synth arpeggios, and angelic children's choirs. Many tracks on Hurry Up We're Dreaming gave me a strong 80s vibe, but this one always felt kinda more to me like a 70s singer-songwriter cut, possibly thanks to the particular style of vocal harmonies on display here. And its earnest simplicity but deep emotionality made it hold up as my personal favorite cut on the entire second disc of this album. Number 7. Lower Your Eyelids to Die with the Sun from Before the Dawn Heals Us. One last cut from Before the Dawn Heals Us. I imagine this one's going to be ranking a lot higher on other people's lists than it currently is on my own. It may very well be the single most grandiose track M83 have ever made, a 10-minute post-rock epic with slow but intense banging drums, yelping vocal chops, absolutely massive and imposing but still warm and welcoming pads of synths and full choirs. There's not a lot of progression over the course of those 10 minutes. It pretty much just delivers one single big climax, and then very slowly dies down into subtle ambience at the end. But as far as album closers go, this is one of their absolute strongest, and it was great after 2 albums that ended in tracks that had the old 2000 CD hidden track gimmick, to just get a 10-minute track that was exactly what it advertised itself to be. There are definitely other M83 tracks that had more of a coherent tune that happened to connect with me on a deeper level than this one did, but I have a feeling plenty of people are going to be marking this track as their number 1 favorite track from the band overall, just thanks to the sheer impressive scale it operates on, and if so, it absolutely will have been deserved. Number 6. Go from Junk. Junk has been a weird album to look back on in retrospect, since it is such an odd one-off anomaly in the M83 catalog. so much cheesier and sillier and goofier than anything the band ever did in all its plastic late 70s throwbacks. And that particular tone has made it a bit of a controversial entry in their catalog, but I've always found that album's silliness to be pretty endearing, and as usual, the new instrumental palette never takes precedence over nailing down the emotional core underneath everything. And I think the best example of this album's unique strengths is its second track here, which switches off between some slightly repetitive low-key verses, a literal countdown building up with all these quirky funk guitars, and paying off in one especially satisfying chorus as well as an epic guitar solo at the end for good measure. It's the kind of track that could soundtrack some little kid's birthday party, and the tune is incessantly catchy, but the mix of celebratory childishness has an oddly nostalgic melancholy behind it as well, and it never feels too shallow for its own good. It may very well be the most fun track that this usually more serious band has delivered, but it doesn't sacrifice any of their usual core strengths in the process either. Still love it. Number 5. Midnight City from Hurry Up We're Dreaming. Here we go, the obvious big hit. I imagine I'm not the only person who, whenever I hear the name M83, I immediately hear those distorted yelps playing in my head. You can call this track overrated or too simple if you like. You could call it a retread of their older track Kim and Jesse, which is kind of structured in the same way, sounds pretty similar. But I absolutely feel like this track deserved to launch M83 to the mainstream in the way that it did, and I think it remains pretty iconic to this day. The walls of synth, the stripped-back 80s beats of the verses, the imagery of driving through the city at night. I've always found inspiration in that kind of imagery in my own work all the time, even well before I heard Hurry Up We're Dreaming for the first time. And of course, we can't forget the sax solo, really the element of this track that makes it go the extra mile for me and notches it up as high as it is. Well, okay, it's still primarily here for being the first track I think of when I think of M83, but yeah, still love this track and come back to it all the time. I think it's fully deserving of the success it got. I had even expected this to rank a fair bit higher in this list, although I ended up gravitating more towards some deeper cuts that I feel get more overlooked, such as Number 4. Hell Riders from DSV2. I have no idea how much love DSV2 is going to get on other people's lists, but man, this album has really stuck with me as something special and remained surprisingly replayable in spite of the occasional track which I tend to skip more often than not. The whole sci-fi 90s anime soundtrack vibe of it all always really effectively pulled me in and kept me wanting to come back to it. Gotta turn that on, it's starting to get dark. And the track that's always stuck with me the most strongly is definitely the album's opener here. It may have an especially slow start with nearly 2 minutes of an extremely minimal ambient drone, but once those plucking guitars kick in and the tune really starts to get going, it turns into one of the single most epic moments in their whole catalog. And I'll even be spicy and say this stands as my personal favorite album opener on any M83 album. The way this thing builds with its layers of guitars and video game synths going up next to surprisingly catchy choir melodies, and paying off into one of their trademark emotional climaxes with big banging drums and all the other elements of the track coming together, just really pulls me into the world of this whole album in such a damn effective way. I admittedly wouldn't be surprised if this track ends up not getting much love from other people, given how much of a mixed reception the surrounding album got from fans, but for me, this is easily one of the most underrated cuts in their catalog. Number 3. Skin of the Night from Saturdays Equals Youth. Okay, here we go. This is the entrant on this list that most recently notched its spot here. Saturdays Equals Youth, for as consistent and cohesive an album it is and how well it nails its 80s aesthetics, has always been an album that weirdly never really brought me back in for that many repeat listens. I always enjoyed it a lot whenever I would come back to it, but just never really found myself in the mood for it that often. So needless to say, when I revisited for my review, I was absolutely not prepared for this cut to hit me on the level that it did. It's not one of the big singles, it wasn't a track that I remembered anything about before reviewing the album, but holy shit did this track get to me. And it's not the kind of track that I'd think would really work for me on paper. Instrumentally, it's as 80s a track as one can possibly get. The standard old school texture of 80s drum machines, the standard 80s new wave guitar textures and synth builds, and lyrically it's kinda weird too. I think it's about a vampire girl or something, and there's a bizarrely gory verse where she pulls open her own chest. I don't know. But shit, this track just sounds absolutely incredible, and is primarily being carried by vocalist Morgan Kibbe. Her fairly understated delivery absolutely carries this track, and can make even the weirder lyrics feel oddly comforting and poetic. And the way her vocal melodies play off of Gonzalez's vocal melodies, and the way they kind of wrap around each other, and still form a hook that lodges in my head so effectively, these elements alone are so freaking well done that they make any possible criticisms I could level at the track not really matter. I just don't even know what else to say. Yet another really underappreciated cut in their catalog. Number 2. I'm Happy, She Said, from M83. Right, I think it's time to give some love to the self-titled album, which, after I've gone through this series, has really held up for me a lot better than I expected. It's just kept growing on me the longer I've worked on this series, and I'd actually probably scored a bit higher now than when I did my review. This album's really underappreciated, I feel like. Now, I expected to say that I thought Lower Your Eyelids to Die with the Sun was their best album closer, and certainly that track is much better produced than this one, which carries more of that old lo-fi style that characterizes this earliest period in their catalog. But as I've sat with this one more, no, I gotta say this wins for me. I think this one packs an even greater emotional punch. It does have the downside of featuring a hidden track at the end, but I'm not counting that. What I love about this cut in particular is all the different phases it goes through. The first section having the grand epicness of many other M83 album closers, but that more lo-fi production makes the experience feel markedly more intimate and oddly easier to connect with. Those walls of organs and synths and nostalgic bells driving such an emotional high that it has this real sense of finality to it. If it were just that section, this track could have made it up decently high on this list on its own, but the two stretches of ambience that follow really help make it go the extra mile for me. Both the whooshing wind section that carries light echoes of the previous sounds, and the final loops of orchestral samples to close things out on that perfect melancholy note. Once again, I wasn't going into this video expecting to praise this track as much as I have. Previously, I remembered it for just being one of my earliest frustrations with a hidden track making an album closer look larger scale than it really was. But the main track is already over 10 minutes. It's not as misleading as I felt it was when I first heard this album. I mean, not much else to say. The track may be clunky for some, but for me personally, it settled its place as the most satisfying finish to any M83 album overall. But before I get into the number 1, here's a bunch of honorable mentions. Moonchild from Before the Dawn Heals Us. Moon Crystal from Junk. She Stands Up from M83.
Do you think he slipped on Shaft? How would I know about that?
Unrecorded from Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts. Road Blaster from Junk. Caresses from M83. Couleurs from Saturdays Equals Youth. Feelings from DSV2. Klaus, I Love You from Hurry Up We're Dreaming. The Highest Journey from Digital Shades Volume 1. Up from Saturdays Equals Youth. Mirage from DSV2. Walkway Blues from Junk. Slowly from M83. Lunar Sun from DSV2. A Guitar and a Heart from Before the Dawn Heals Us. Outro from Hurry Up We're Dreaming. That is literally as short as I could possibly make that list of honorable mentions. I could pretty easily expand that list out to 25 or even 30, but I didn't want to keep you here that long. Was not expecting this to be so hard to cut down. These guys really do have that many great tracks. But anyway, let's finally get into my personal favorite of them. Number 1. Reunion from Hurry Up We're Dreaming. I already knew for a fact that this was going to be topping this list even before I started work on this series, but I don't even fully know how to describe a track like Reunion or put into words how it's managed to stand in this place. It's certainly not the most original track M83 ever came up with. It's fairly derivative of stadium rock bands, and especially like Joshua Tree era U2. The whoa-whoa choruses went on to become a really played-out millennial pop cliche, and one could also complain about the spoken monologue from Morgan Kibbe, which feels kind of disappointing for that to be her only vocal contribution on the album after so absolutely killing it on Saturdays Equals Youth. But man, this track just hits me on such a visceral, primal level. The groove is so unbelievably propulsive, the sound is so euphoric and soaring. Whenever this track comes on, I feel like I get a boost of energy jolted into me in the best possible way. I become more awake, I feel more alive. It's a track that makes me want to go outside and run around like a little kid with too much energy. And I fucking hate running. Other M83 tracks may hit me on a deeper emotional level, or impress me more, or even have catchier tunes. But none of them give me this wholly physical reaction that resonates through my entire body like Reunion does. For that alone, and for how happy it can instantly make me feel, I didn't feel like I had any other choice besides to mark it as my favorite, as my personal favorite M83 song. And yeah, that's the list. The next discography review is going to be Music, Mike Paradinas, so you can look forward to that. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.